Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Devlin Capizzi, and I'm from the Rx-360 Secretariat. Welcome to this web conference. This web conference has been put together by the Rx-360 EU GMP Part 3 Working Group and is titled Requirements to Import APIs into Europe as part of the Falsified Medicines Directive. So at the front end of this session, very briefly, I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping matters. First, I'd like to mention those from the Rx-360 EU GMP Part 3 Working Group who will be moderating this teleconference webinar today. Our two co-moderators are Graham Cook from Pfizer and Steve Porter from AstraZeneca. They will also be joined by Melissa Seymour of Biogenetic and Barb Unger from Amgen. The team will be available to answer questions at the end of the session. Just very briefly, Graham Cook is part of Pfizer's Global Quality Strategy Group working on regulatory intelligence and external engagement. He's currently leading the Pfizer team implementing the GMP aspects of the EU Falsified Medicines Directive. Steve Porter is a QA professional with approximately 36 years experience in the industry of dosage forms and APIs. He has worked as a QA director within AZ's Global External Sourcing Group for the last 5.5 years. Melissa Seymour is the Senior Director of Corporate Quality for Biogenetic, assuming responsibility for global compliance and global quality systems, including management of quality systems, internal and external auditing, and global affiliate GMP oversight. Barb Unger joined Amgen in 2004, and she's currently the Director in the External Affairs Group of International Quality. She developed, implemented, and currently has responsibility for the GMP Surveillance and Intelligence Program at Amgen. And Barb is also the lead for the monitoring and reporting workstream of Rx-360. So I'd like to just thank those four for all their help in preparing this session, and also thank the working group for their help. If you can see your slide now, what I'd like to do is just cover a couple of housekeeping matters relating to how we will proceed this morning and this afternoon. So please note that all lines of the attendees are they are all muted at this point. But when we get to the question and answer session, you will have the opportunity to raise your hand, so to speak. So if you look on your screen, you will see that there is an option where you can press a hand, and what will happen is we will be notified that you have a question. We will then unmute your line, and we will announce your name and ask you to pose the question. And our team on the line will do its best to respond to your question. We also have an option where one can send us a question through the sort of the written form. And what we will do there is, again, if time permits, we will try to answer the question live for folks. But if we do not have enough time for questions, we are happy to pass those back to the Rx-360 team and try to address them after this call. The next slide is just a quick disclaimer. Rx-360 has made every effort to make sure that the information presented today is as accurate as of the time we're sharing it with you. But obviously changes in law or circumstances might occur after the issue date, and therefore the information might not be accurate. We hope it is, but just to note that this is time sensitive and is accurate as of when it was presented. And then just to also remind people, we're offering this for information purposes. We do hope there's a good discussion after the material is presented, but please do not construe any of this as legal advice. Okay, so thank you all for joining us, and what I'd like to do now is pass over the first part of the meeting to Graham Cook from Pfizer.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. What I want to do is start off by giving you an overview of what we're going to cover. We're going to start with a couple of slides on the introduction to the EU Falsified Medicines Directive, just to orientate you. I'm sure you're all familiar with some of the content at least. Then we're going to look at some survey highlights from the Rx-360 survey, because there's some interesting information there. And then we thought this would be most helpful to you if we actually looked at a number of different importation scenarios so that you can see some of the nuances of how the directive is supposed to work and some of the issues that many companies are trying to manage at the moment in order to ensure that we don't have any problems with our supply chain and supply of medicines to patients, not only in Europe but also elsewhere around the world. So that's what we're going to cover today. If we can move forward, Megan. I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is the EU Falsified Medicines Directive in one slide. You can see its objective is to prevent the introduction into the legal supply chain of medicines which are falsified with respect to identity, source, and history. And there are really 4 pillars to the directive. The first of these concerns so-called safety features. These are serialization and tamper evidence aspects, and these don't come into effect until about 2017. Then there are some provisions regarding importers, brokers, and distributors, and also some GDPs for APIs. These have already come into effect as of 2nd of January this year, as has the next pillar, which is to do with GMP, appropriate GMPs for excipients, and then the topic that we're going to focus on today, which is API importation, which comes in as of 2nd of July 2013. The last pillar is internet sales, which comes in next year. And so really what we're focused on is the API importation aspects, which come into effect, as you can see, on the 2nd of July this year. Now, before we move forward, let me just explain a little bit about the fact that as an EU directive, this has to be translated into national law by the European member states. And as of the day we're speaking, only 3 member states that I'm aware of have really fully translated this into national law. So the implementation of this directive is a little bit staggered across the different member states, and that's presenting some interesting challenges for us in industry and also for our colleagues in the regulatory agencies. So if we can move forward, Megan. Okay, so let's just remind you of the conditions for the importation of active substances into Europe. The first of these is if the country is listed by the European Commission, then we can simply carry on importing active substances exactly as we do today, importation without restriction. The second mechanism is if the active supplier in a third country is able to obtain a written confirmation from their competent health authority that the GMPs that they're using and the oversight by that health authority is equivalent to those in the European Union. So those are the 2 main mechanisms that were envisaged to allow importation of active substances or APIs into Europe. If you read the directive, you'll see that there is actually a third case, which is the exception case, where a waiver can be granted by an importing member state to allow importation where there is not a written confirmation and where the country isn't listed. And this is to allow importation in order to secure supplies of medicines. There is an important caveat to that exception case, and for this waiver to be granted, the directive stipulates that the API supplier has to have an EU GMP certificate, and we'll look at the consequences of that when we get into the scenarios in a few moments. Now, where are we today? If you can hit some of the bills, Megan. So far, as I'm sure you're all aware, there's only about half a dozen countries that have actually applied for listing. So there's a small number of countries that have applied for listing, and only Switzerland to date has actually been listed by the European Commission. I'm sure you're aware that many companies have been making requests to their active substance suppliers to try and obtain written confirmations from health authorities. But I think the situation seems to be that there are very few of these being issued as we speak. And in many cases, mechanisms aren't in place at the moment to allow the issuance of these written confirmations by health authorities in the different third countries around the world. So that really leaves us with the exception case may be our only option for importation of some active substances, because obviously we're already at the beginning of February. The directive is supposed to be implemented in the 2nd of July, and time is running out for us to do anything. So let's move on to the next slide. And I think now we're looking at the Rx-360 survey highlights. This was a survey done amongst members of Rx-360 at the end of last year to try and get some idea of the awareness and nature of the problem. You can see some information about the survey, how it was publicized, and the survey respondents. Pretty good number of companies responded, both members and non-members. And as you can see, most of the respondents were actually suppliers of APIs, manufacturers of pharmaceutical products, and or suppliers of excipients. So pretty good representation of the industry. We can move on, Megan. Okay, so this is a slide which has some interesting information about countries actually supplying active substances based on the response from the survey. As you can see, the most common countries, as you might expect, would be USA, China, India, Switzerland in there as well, which is, as we know, the only country that's listed, and also Japan. And so you can see there are 3 countries out of that first group of countries which are either listed or have applied for listing, and 2 important countries which have not. In the fairly common countries, you can see that both Brazil and Singapore, which have also applied for listing, feature. But there are some important countries there which have not applied for listing. And the status of some of those countries is, in terms of their willingness or ability to issue written confirmations or intention to apply for listing, is unclear. Amongst the rare countries, it's quite interesting, and I just want to pick out 1 or 2 countries and comment on them there. You'll see that Croatia is listed. You can move back, Megan. Croatia, interestingly, will be joining the European Union on the 1st of July this year. So at the moment, you would have to import into the Union from Croatia, but hopefully when the directive becomes effective, Croatia will then be considered part of the European Union. Israel is listed there. You'll have seen that Israel was a country that had applied for listing, and there are some hiccups, and we might, if we've got time, get into some of the background behind that later. But for the moment, I think Israel is intending to issue written confirmations. Norway is also in that list. Norway is actually a member of the EEA, the kind of wider European Economic Area. And for the purposes of the directive, you'll see that it has text that's relevant to EEA countries. So Norway effectively can be considered part of the European Union for the purposes of the Falsified Medicines Directive. So the message behind this slide is basically you need to understand if you're importing from a particular country, particularly countries like Monaco. I must admit I have no understanding of how one would import into Monaco, because although it's got close ties to France, it's not part of the European Union. So you need to do your homework, is the message about this slide. Let's move on to the next slide. This just gives you some idea of the numbers of different APIs imported by different companies. So significant number of APIs imported, as you can see there, 1,000, over 1,000 APIs imported, as we would expect from the nature of the industry today. We move on to the next slide. This gives you a feel for numbers of APIs imported with a current EU GMP certificate. You remember the significance of that in relation to importation under the Waiver clause. So a rather smaller number which have current EU GMP certificates. And if we move on to the next slide, you can see a rather larger number of APIs imported without any kind of GMP certificate. And so that's a significant concern. And we'll look at the consequences of that when we get into the scenarios in a few moments. So if we can move on to the next slide. So now we're going to get into the scenarios. And you can see we've got 4 different scenarios we're going to consider. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Steve Porter from AstraZeneca. He's going to take you through the first scenario, which is the most straightforward one, where a third country is listed. So, Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Graham. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So, as Graham mentioned, I'm going to start by talking through what is the easiest scenario, the most straightforward scenario. Graham mentioned that there are actually 7 countries that have applied for what's called the white listing, and Switzerland has been adopted. Israel, as Graham mentioned, wasn't successful, but we believe they will issue templates, and there's 5 other countries there going through the assessment process. And there is a list that is published by the European Commission on their website, which gives you the current status of this assessment process, which you can refer to in your own time, obviously. So as Graham mentioned, we've got some scenarios pulled together here, and this one here is looking at the importation of an API manufactured by a fictional company called Swisschem AG in Switzerland, and it's going into a company in the UK called Brit Pharma, where they're going to make tablets. And the process, as it is described, and we believe it will work, is that obviously Brit Pharma needs to confirm that their supply chain is as they believe it is, and that Swisschem AG is actually manufacturing this API example list for them in Switzerland, and that's just following normal good supply management procedures. Brit Pharma clearly need to make sure that Switzerland remains on the published list in the official journal of the European Union, and then the QP at Brit Pharma can release the tablets manufactured using this API, provided no changes to the site of manufacture of the API. It's just worth mentioning here that as part of the directive, Brit Pharma will be considered to be importing API from outside of the EU, will therefore have to go through a registration process, and that is ongoing at the moment. So if we move to the next slide, please. And I think there's a couple of bullets to add on. Right. So clearly, they've been using this API supplier for a while, and they have a stock of API in the on the factory there, which they've used to be making tablets. And the due date, the date of implementation of the directive, we said, is the 2nd of July. They have API made in April. Can they use that? And the answer is yes. There is no restriction on the use of API irrespective of date of manufacture. So whether it's made before July or after July, they can carry on using that API and release into market. Swisschem, in this scenario, are a global organization. They have another plant in India which operates under the same quality system, and Brit Pharma have been using parallel supply chains for these two materials. It's the same quality system. So what is the status of the API coming in from this site in India after the 2nd of July 2013? So clearly India aren't on this white list. So unless they will issue the written confirmation under option 2, or they can apply potentially through this waiver option 3, then unless either of those two criteria are met, Brit Pharma can't continue to import API from that site in India. However, they could continue to use stock that they imported before the 2nd of July deadline. So they have an option there to stock build to give them some mitigation whilst they work out their options around where India will end up under the Falsified Medicines Directive. Now in this example scenario, we've taken the situation where Brit Pharma have some tablets made from the same API in phase 2 of the clinic, but they've used the Indian supply to make those tablets. What happens after the 2nd of July 2013? Well, they can continue to do that. No change is necessary since the Falsified Medicines Directive does not apply to investigational products. But clearly, Brit Pharma need to make sure they have absolute segregation between these two supply chains to make sure there is no mix-up and that the Indian material is not going into commercial product. With that, run through of the most straightforward scenario, I'll pass back to Graham.
Thank you, Steve. Let's move on and look at the next scenario, which is importation using a written confirmation. And in this scenario, we've got a different active substance, example PAM, which is being imported from the API supplier called Maple, this is again a fictional supplier called Maple Chem Inc., and they're located in Canada, and they're supplying API to a company, US Big Pharma Inc., who have a tablet manufacturing plant in Ireland where they're making FMD tablets. So in this scenario, and incidentally, Canada has actually indicated in writing to the European Union that they plan to issue written confirmations. So Maple Chem Inc. request Health Canada to provide a written confirmation that the Canadian GMPs and oversight of their facility by Health Canada equivalent to that in the EU. And they then obtain this written confirmation. When they then send consignments of the API to Ireland, each consignment must be accompanied by a copy of that written confirmation from Health Canada. So each consignment has to be accompanied by a copy. The QP at US Big Pharma in Ireland can then release FMD tablets if the example PAM, which is imported after the 2nd of July, is accompanied by a written confirmation from Maple Chem Inc., issued by Health Canada. So that's the scenario. Let's just look at the next slide at some of the nuances of that. So can FMD tablets made in August 2013 using example PAM imported before the 2nd of July cutoff, in other words, in this scenario imported in April, without a written confirmation be released for sale in Ireland? And the answer is yes. Importation requirements, as we've already heard from Steve, only apply after the 2nd of July 2013. Now, what about the situation where FMD tablets made in Ireland in September 2013 using example PAM imported in August 2013 but without a written confirmation, can they be released for sale in Argentina? And the answer is no, that product that's manufactured in Europe for export markets still has to comply with the Falsified Medicines Directive. So API importation requirements also apply to medicines made in the EU that are intended solely for export. The final scenario is that the company is making FMD tablets for Norwegian blue parrots. So here we have a veterinary product being made in Ireland, again in September 2013, using example PAM imported for veterinary products after the 2nd of July date without a written confirmation. Again, can they be released for sale in Argentina? In this scenario, yes, the directive, they can be released for sale because the directive doesn't apply to veterinary medicines. However, what you've got to be careful for here is that you need to be sure how the importing API is being assigned for use and any reassignment of use after it's been imported. Because obviously if it's intended for use in human medicinal products for commercial sale, you must have a written confirmation in this scenario if it's imported after the 2nd of July 2013. So that's the second scenario. I'll now hand back to Steve, and he's going to take you through the third scenario.
Thanks, Graham. And just to pull it together a bit there, clearly the white list is 7 countries, 1 accepted, 1 not met all the criteria, 5 still under evaluation. 1 or 2 countries we know about have indicated they will issue the written confirmation of equivalence to EU GMPs. So this scenario, the third option, the waiver scenario, may take on more importance than was originally intended when the Falsified Medicines Directive was prepared. And in there we need to remind ourselves that it was stated that it should only be used where necessary to ensure the availability of medicinal products, and only as long as a GMP certificate is in existence for the company we're talking about. So, going through the slide here, this is the kind of logic flow that this fictional company in Sweden, Pharma, would go through to assess their options for the importation of waiver APIs, we've called it. They confirm that this third country where it's been made, so outside of the EU, is not listed under option 1, so they've gone to the Commission website and checked that out. The manufacturing API company, another chem, has gone to their regulatory authority and discussed with them whether they're able to get the written confirmation, and that's been declined. They say they're not willing to work in that way. So they're in a position where, for legal reasons, this third country will not issue a written confirmation. So if we move to the next slide, please, and fill in the bullets. Okay. So what they do understand that, through their routine supplier management and for other reasons, that this company, another chem, were actually inspected by the Swedish Medicines Authority, the MPA, in July of 2012. And a certificate was issued which is valid for the 3-year period through to July 2015. So Pharma, the formulation plant here in Europe, discussed with their local regulatory authority, the MPA, the use of this waiver clause and continued importation of waiver API for the manufacture and release of these tablets is agreed and accepted after 2nd of July 2013. And we just need to note here that the individual member state needs to inform the European Commission that they are actually working under the waiver for this product. Just taking this scenario to a slightly different situation. In this instance, the inspection was a bit further back. It was actually in April 2010, and the GMP certificate issued valid until April of this year. So what do they do now? Clearly they contact the MPA to request a reinspection, And that happens in April of this year, completed, and a new GMP certificate is issued. 3-year life through to April 2016. And again, MPA and SWE Pharma need to have the discussion, and MPA agree that they can continue to import this Waiver API and manufacture and release the tablets to the market after 2nd of July 2013 until the expiry date of the new GMP certificate, which is in April 2016. So if you move through to the next slide, please. So maybe this third scenario here could be quite realistic, as we know there are a large number of sites that are requesting GMP inspections at the moment. So this company was inspected in April 2010. The certificate is valid until April 2013. They request an inspection, but due to conflicting priorities and resources, that can't take place until 2013. So what does SWE Pharma can do? They can carry on using API that was imported before 2nd of July of this year to manufacture tablets and release to market. Clearly they can't import any product after the 2nd of July of 2013. They negotiate the reinspection of another chem company, and again that is successful. A new certificate is issued, which is valid through to 2016. SWE Pharma then negotiate and agree with the MPA that again they can continue to or recommence importation of the API and manufacture again with this new stocks of API and complete release through to market. So I think that's the end of that scenario, and then back to you, Graham, I think.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so now we get into scenario four, and you can see it's getting a bit more interesting. In this scenario, we have a supplier located in a third country that doesn't have an EU GMP certificate. So here we have the company Extrachem making no-cert API, active substance, in a third country, and this is being used by Pharma AB to manufacture germ tabs in their manufacturing plant in Germany. So if we walk through the scenario again, first of all, Pharma confirms that the third country isn't listed on the Commission's whitelist under option 1. So Extrachem requests third country regulatory authorities to provide this written confirmation that their GMPs and oversights of Extrachem is equivalent to those in the EU. And for whatever reason, for legal reasons, the third country won't issue or is not in a position to issue this written confirmation. And so we're left in the situation where the Extrachem manufacturing site has not been inspected by an EU authority and therefore doesn't have a GMP certificate. So let's move on to the next slide and see what the company can do about this situation. So firstly, Pharma decides it needs to request an inspection of the Extrachem manufacturing site by an EU authority. You may be aware that the MHRA has been working with other member states, agencies from other member states, to try and get an understanding of the number of API manufacturing sites worldwide that might require inspection. And I think we've heard that the number is perhaps around 800 or more sites. So a significant volume of work for the inspectorate, and it's not clear that the EU agencies have sufficient resources to complete all the inspections that might be necessary in time to assure continued supply of API into Europe by 2nd of July. So it's quite likely that Pharma would have to wait for scheduling of an inspection of that API facility. And if that's the case, they may not be able to import API, this no-cert API after 2nd of July until the inspection and issuance of a GMP certificate for Extrachem. As we've seen, Pharma can import the no-cert API for use up to the 2nd of July 2013 implementation date. And they can continue to use this API as long as it's been imported prior to 2nd of July 2013. So Pharma decides that what they need to do is to try and build some API stock and perhaps also finished product stock to try and tide them over the period between before they can get an EU GMP inspection of the no-cert API manufacturing facility. Now, it turns out that no cert API is available from another supplier in Switzerland, and so Pharma is also then faced with another part of their contingency planning in terms of whether to qualify this new supplier in order to allow the release of germ tabs using Swiss supply based on the fact that API imported from Switzerland would be acceptable because Switzerland is a listed country. Unfortunately, the amount of work that is necessary for Pharma to do to get this material and qualify this supplier is just not possible to achieve that before the 2nd of July this year. So in that particular situation, Pharma are now faced with the possibility that there may be shortages of their product if it's not possible for them to build stocks because of the supply situation. So let's move on to the next slide. And I think I'm handing back to you, Steve, just to wrap up for the discussion in terms of the future outlook.
Yep, sure, thanks. And very briefly just run through the points that are summarised here. I think it's fair to say that this is a very rapidly changing area, and as we said at the beginning of the presentation, what we've spoken about very much represents the situation as of today, and countries will be appearing on that white list or passing assessment over the next few weeks, and we hope to get more information about which countries are doing the written confirmation. So the situation is very, very mobile, let's say, so I think it's in the best interest of all of us to keep a good sight on the key websites and make sure we're fully up to speed with the information that's coming through. Clearly, the 2nd of July 2013, when these importation changes come into force, is coming up very, very quickly, and that's when the written confirmation is required. We've spoken about the limited number of companies on the white list and issuing templates, and Graham just mentioned the large number of companies out there which do not have GMP certificates. This has the potential to cause drug shortages, and I think we all have a concern that where there are shortages of anything, that maybe gives opportunity for the more unscrupulous people in the world, and there could therefore actually be an increase in counterfeit products in the in the marketplace. So that's something I think that we as organisations need to be very, very aware of, and to make sure that we do our best to maintain the supply of products we can do within the framework of the Falsified Medicines Directive. Recent updates, we know US has applied to go into the white list as of a couple of weeks back. India, again, there's been lots of discussion in India and well reported through the internet, and we now believe that India are moving to a position where they will issue written confirmations, but I'm not aware of, I've certainly not seen any of those yet, and we've requested our suppliers to provide those, and we haven't been not seen any yet. Just worth mentioning China. Again, 10 days back, they started requesting information of their API manufacturers or API manufacturers based in China, and there's a feeling that will maybe the first step towards China moving towards issuing some written confirmations for a limited number of companies. But again, that situation is far from clear, and we need to watch that situation closely over the next weeks and months, because clearly China is a key player in the API industry. So with that, I think it's move forward and move into a Q&A session, and pass back to Megan and Mary to facilitate that.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve and Graham. And in terms of time management, I think we're doing very, very well. We have about 25 minutes left for the webinar, so I think that's better than I anticipated. So I would like now for any attendees who are interested in a discussion on the subject and have a question to pose, you have two options to pose your question. The first option is to raise your hand. So if you look at your screen, there's an option that you can press on the hand. It's a raised hand, and then we will unmute you and sort of prompt you to pose your question to the group. The other way to pose your question is to submit the question just by writing it on your screen and sending it through to us. And we will do our best to try to take as many questions as we can. We do have a packed webinar, but we'll do our best. I do see one question, so I am going to unmute Yunan Shai, and I apologize if I haven't pronounced your name correctly, but you should be unmuted now. If you could please pose your question to the group. That's Yunan Shai. Yunan? Okay, I don't hear a question forthcoming, so I'm going to go to the next person. Okay, Richard Moraton, you are now unmuted. Can you please pose your question to the group?
Yes, it's a very simple question, I hope. We know that documentation frequently gets separated during transit for various reasons. Does the panel think that it would be acceptable to fax copies of the transit documents, including the copy of the written confirmation or whatever else is required, ahead of time, just to safeguard that? Would that be acceptable, do you think, to allow the QPs to release?
Turning the question back to our team, and we do have 4 folks who are in a position to try to answer the question. We have our 2 co-moderators, Graham and Steve. We also have Melissa and Barb. Can any of you take that question?
This is Barb. I think the challenge will be, and this seems to be a country-specific issue that is still in flux, is that documentation may need to be with the shipment, with the actual lots of API as they are imported into the country. Now, whether that evaluation is going to go on through customs and the excise groups, it's not clear to me, but that would be my concern about shipping documentation ahead of time and not including it with the shipment itself.
I was going to include both with the shipment and send it ahead of time.
I don't see any reason why you couldn't do that.
Okay, thank you.
If I just build onto that, I mean, I think we're waiting to see how this will work, and I think we'll all be discussing it with our suppliers. But I think one scenario I was thinking through was that these written confirmations would also be cross-referenced from things like certificates of conformance by the suppliers, where they can cross-reference the reference number of that, so you have that full traceability that the written confirmation was valid at the time of manufacture and the time of release of that product. And it may be also worth keeping a master copy in your own supplier files for future purpose as well, because these are, they're not batch-specific documents. They are documents with a finite life.
Yeah, this is Graham. If I can just build on a point that Barb made, which was that this is in a state of flux. The way that the health authorities in the different countries will check that written confirmations are accompanying the shipment and that therefore a company is in compliance is not clear and may vary from one member state to another depending on how member states actually implement the directive. So you need to understand which member states you're dealing with and what their approach is. For example, we've heard from the MHRA that they intend to inspect at the manufacturing site, and I believe that there is no intent for customs and excise people in the UK to verify that a shipment is accompanied by a written confirmation. We've still got to see the final implementation of the law in the UK, so don't take my word for it. You need to check. But the point is that you could see differences country to country across Europe. Be aware of that and make sure that you understand exactly what your importation routes are and where possibility for checks may be. And so I think the suggestion to fax something ahead as well as accompanying the shipment is probably a very sound contingency.
Okay, we are going to move on because we have many questions coming in. So I am going to go to the next hand that I see raised, and that is Ralph Lindblad. So Ralph, you should now be unmuted to pose your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. There's been a lot of detail spent around suppliers, meaning manufacturers, as I'm understanding this. There's one gap that I haven't seen described or discussed today is the distributors, or the true suppliers of material, not the manufacturers. What's the expectation for those particular firms? Are users to audit those sites, as well as are those sites expected to have GDP certification as well?
This is Graham. That's a really good question.
Is that something
Yeah, shall I carry on? That's a really good question. The directive obviously includes some provisions for distributors and expectations around distributors, as well as some new expectations around good distribution practices for APIs. Now, there are provisions for registration of API activities concerning importation, distribution, and manufacture. Those have to be implemented at a member state level, and as we've said already, only 3 member states currently that we're aware of have implemented and maybe have mechanisms in place to do that. So it's not clear whether we've got uniform systems or systems, indeed any kind of system in place in many member states in Europe, even though we're technically past the implementation date of 2nd of January for those provisions. Furthermore, the guidance that we're expecting on GDPs for APIs, the understanding is that the Inspectors Working Group has prepared that and ratified. They were happy with that at their meeting towards the end of November. That's apparently gone to the Commission for publication, but the last time I checked websites, we're still waiting on publication of that guidance, and indeed also a similar high-level guidance on a risk-based approach to GMPs for excipients.
And again, just to build on to that, that's my understanding of the status of the GDP for APIs, but I do understand the principles of it will be expected to be applied outside of the EU as well as inside the EU. So I think if you're dealing with a distributor outside of the EU, then there may well be an expectation to fully understand the quality system and maybe do an on-site audit there.
Okay, let's move on to another question. I'm going to unmute the line of Charles Stankovic. So if you just give me 1 second, you will be ready to be heard, and you can pose your question. Please go ahead, Charles.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. We manufacture an API that is used in Europe in a product that is classified as a medical device, not a drug. Will the directive apply to that API?
Anyone from the team want to take that on? Okay, Charles, that might be something we have to give some thought to offline. So we'll make a note of the question, but I'm not hearing any responses. So why don't we take a note of that, and then we'll follow up. Do you have any other questions?
Yes, for several of the products that we manufacture, they're approved in the United States as well, and we have requested from FDA a certificate of pharmaceutical product. Will the certificate meet the requirement for a written confirmation?
I think it's pretty clear that a CPP would not meet the requirement for a written confirmation. But then if you're importing a medical device, it would be outside of the scope of the Falsified Medicines Directive in terms of the API importation requirements anyway. You can import finished products into Europe, for example, and you do not need to have a written confirmation for API that's manufactured outside of Europe in that situation.
But maybe, I'm sorry, maybe I wasn't clear. We are located in the United States, and we are shipping API to Europe for other pharmaceutical products, and these clearly are drugs. We've requested the COPP for those APIs. And you say it's clear that that does not comply with the written confirmation requirement.
Yeah, you have to have a written confirmation using the template that the Commission has provided.
Ah, so, okay. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to another caller, but before I tee up another caller, I would like to just make it clear to everybody that we will be making these materials available on the Rx-360 website. So they will be, the slides will be available, and then in a few days we'll also be making available a copy of this session. So it is being recorded, as was noted at the beginning of the session. So a few questions have come in written form asking about those 2 points, so I did want to clarify that. Okay, the next person that will be asking a question is Chi-Chi Opa. Chi-Chi, if you can pose your question, you are now unmuted. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. Viox, you are now unmuted. Please pose your question.
Has anyone anticipated how do you verify the veracity of a fake certificate that accompanies an API shipment?
Anyone on the team want to address that?
I think that's a really good question, Guy. I don't know the answer to how one would do this.
Yeah. And I think all that a user company can do is go back to the issuing authority and confirm with them that it is a valid certificate. And I think that's mentioned somewhere in the questions and answers issued by the European Commission.
Yeah, because then maybe we need a blacklist of but it's a tough one. If all the FMD is doing is fighting fake APIs, and we now have a mechanism where people can fake the certificates, you know, maybe the only way we can all address is to work together, and if this becomes apparent, we need to have a whole bunch of whistleblowing.
Yeah, clearly the QP has a responsibility here.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. I'm about to unmute Lisbeth Folsters. Lisbeth, please pose your question to the group.
Hello, thank you. I had a question about the waivers. We had a lot of documents received for the written confirmation. I'm from Belgium and there's absolutely no transposition in local law. So our government or authority is completely not ready. How is it possible for us, and which documents do we have to ask the waiver to all local authorities that are not ready?
Is there anyone on the team with any response for Lisbeth?
That's a really good question.
I mean, the only response I can, sorry, I was going to say the only response I can give is that we've asked the question of 2 or 3 regulatory authorities in Europe about the exact ways of working for the waiver, process. We're still waiting feedback on those questions.
Because we're speaking a lot about no resources for audits, but there will we also need resources to give all the administration on the waivers, and there's nothing said about that. And I'm afraid a lot of people will ask them. So
that's right. Again, waivers the way the directive is set up is that waivers would be issued by member states. So again, we could see differences in member state to member state in how these processes may work. And as Steve has indicated, it is really unclear at the moment about how to go about applying for a waiver and what mechanisms or forms might need to be used to do so.
Okay, and for the audits, is it also possible that the third country manufacturing sites ask for the audits, of an EU member, or does the importer have to do it?
At the moment, for an EU GMP certificate, it has to be an EU agency to perform that. There is no
the agency is.
Directive. There is no provision in the directive for recognition of an audit by, for example, PGA or FDA.
No, I know, but is it possible that, for example, a site in Mexico asks to the EU for an audit because they're doing it right now, but in the directive it states that it should be the importer. So is it always the importer who needs to officially request to the EU, or can it also be the third country site who asks to the EU for the audit or the inspection?
I think you're correct that the way the directive is set up, the request is supposed to come from either the importer or the manufacturing site.
So both is possible.
Okay,
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next question. Linda Hippel, you are now unmuted. Okay, I don't hear her chiming in. So how about Lisa Fisher? Lisa, can you pose your question to the group, please? You're now not on mute. Lisa Fisher? Okay, we're going to go. Is that Lisa? Okay. We're going to try Lorda O'Neill. Lorda, if you're still with us, please pose your question. Okay, we're going to try somebody else. Meg Galwith. Meg, are you with us and in a position to pose your question? Meg Galwith.
My question is the QP, is the drop dead date for the QP the 2nd of July 13th, or is it after, like, if you cannot send out, they can't order any material after that date?
Who would like to take that question?
The material has to
I'll
be
start with the
imported.
2nd of July is the date.
Right.
Sorry, you carry on, Graham.
I was going to say to you that the material has to be in the EU by 2nd of July.
And released by the QP?
No.
Okay, so it just has to be...
You can import a build stock before 2nd of July, manufacture and release after 2nd of July. You
Okay.
can't import after 2nd July if you don't have one of the, the whitelisting, the written confirmation, or work through the waiver process.
Okay, so it has to be inside already the EU.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm looking for additional individuals who are waiting to pose their question live. And I'm going to Rama Zidal. Rama, your line is now unmuted. Please pose your question.
Hello, thank you. I have two questions. One is if it's possible to repeat the status of Israel Ministry of Health request to be listed. And my second question is actually a continuance of Ralph's question about not only distributors, but what do we have to do with the other warehouses, like brokers, like seaport, airport, etc.?
Okay, so there's two questions there. Maybe we can, your first question didn't come through as clearly as your second, so maybe we start with your second, which relates to what do we do with the warehouses, brokers, seaports. So why don't we take that first and throw that to the team, and then I'll have you repeat your first question just so everybody's heard it clearly.
Excuse me, do you want me to repeat the first question?
No need to. So I think let's go to your second question, because I think everybody heard that. So maybe if the team can address that, the implications with respect to warehouses, brokers, seaports.
Okay.
Let's maybe start with the registration requirements for warehouses and so on. One of the things that is not clear, because it's being done at a member state level, is exactly what needs to be registered. Countries like the UK are in the process of putting, or have now issued forms which make it clear what they want registered. That again may vary country to country. Steve or Melissa or Barb, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Only that what we're talking about in terms of importation applies to the manufacturer. We're not asking for, or the EU's not asking for, whitelisting, let's say, of where a warehouse was, if that's in another country on the way through on that supply chain from outside of the EU. The whitelisting, the written declaration, or the waiver just applies to the site of manufacture.
Yeah, I was thinking more of the registration requirements for API activities, where the importer and distributor have to be registered. We've asked questions about whether it's the legal entity or the actual facility that needs to be registered, and I'm not sure we've got absolute clarity there yet, because these systems are being put in place now.
So if I understand correctly, sorry? If I understand correctly, the written confirmation from the Ministry of Health should include all the options of the material to be in. I mean, if there is a warehouse in the airport, it should be included in the written confirmation. Am I right?
No, it's just the manufacturing site of the API.
Okay, but the guide also states all those warehouses that I mentioned. What do we do with all those? What is the meaning of mentioning it in the guide?
There are registration requirements for activities within the EU. So the EU wants to have visibility of the supply chain within the EU. In other words, where does the active substance get imported into the EU, and what happens to it between the importation site and the manufacturing site. So that's why there's a requirement to register these activities, but there is still some lack of clarity about that. There are separate provisions which relate to wholesalers and brokers, which apply to finished product. I think that's probably out of scope of the discussion today, but perhaps that could be addressed outside of this in a follow-up answer to that question.
Okay, and I think we will have to come to a conclusion here. It is the end of the call. Let me make a note that if you have had your hand raised and we didn't get to you, please just put in your question electronically, because we will have sort of a record of those and we can give some thought to how to reply to your questions after this call. Just a reminder, we will be posting the slides on the Rx-360 website. We also have kind of a leave behind in the deck of slides that we didn't get to cover today, just kind of a snapshot of Rx-360 activities and some other information. So I just want to thank our presenters and those that worked hard to put this material together, and also thank all of you for joining us for this discussion today. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.